Hey y'all, welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution, the podcast for secular progressive homeschoolers who are reimagining education for their kids unapologetically. I am your host, Ashley. Today's episode came from a listener and they asked a very specific question. How do I talk to my 5-year-old about race and racism? I actually really love this question because I think it was honest and it was raw. And I think sometimes parents are looking for a script. Like, what do I say? When's the exact moment I should bring it up? How often do I bring it up? What books do I buy? How much is too much? And for me, I have a 5-year-old and I had to think about how I have that conversation with him and like with my older kids and what that looks like in our house. And my answer is, yeah, we should be teaching our kids about race and racism, but teaching a 5-year-old about race looks different than, me teaching my 9 and my 14-year-old. It's something you build over time. And I don't remember ever having like one big race talk, and honestly, there isn't really one perfect anti-racism curriculum out there. And I don't think you can buy a box curriculum that says, oh, all right, racism is covered. Check, 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 check. No. But what I do think should happen is building the foundation of racial literacy, because that develops the same way so many other parts of our education develops. We introduce something, we add vocabulary, we revisit, we add history, then we add complexity to it, over time. And eventually we expect our kids to analyze things for themselves. So let's start at 5. What does that look like for my 5-year-old? So like I said, I don't really sit my 5-year-old down and explicitly teach racism, not yet anyway. And, I don't have a curriculum or a worksheet that says, today we're studying systemic oppression in 5-year-old language. He's 5. Right now, a lot of our racial education is about identity and representation and difference and fairness and belonging. And my son actually has given us some very funny, I guess you could say they're funny opportunities to talk about it. So if you didn't know, I am biracial. I am Black and Mexican. My husband is Black. Our children we've had together are very light skinned. I mean, my middle and my youngest kid are very light skinned with like sandy brown hair and like hazel-ish eyes. My oldest kid, light skin, dark hair, dark eyes. I'm light skinned. My husband is very brown. And my 5-year-old has noticed that me and him look alike, but he is not the same color as his dad, which is true, And apparently my kid took that observation and developed his own theory of racial classification. So at one point he thought he was a white boy. And his dad was the Black guy in the family who didn't look like anybody else. And we were like, what? And like he randomly said it while we were eating. And he was like, did you know I was a white boy? And we were, wait, what? And so my kids were all looking at each other and then we kind of laughed. But we understood that it was a very important like parenting moment for me and my husband, because we know nobody sat him down and taught him that. He was doing what a lot of young kids do. He was observing and he was sorting things out and trying to categorize things and just trying to understand what he was seeing. And in his mind, for us, and this is me interpreting it, Daddy has darker skin. Daddy is Black. I don't have skin like Daddy, therefore I must not be Black. And for a 5-year-old logic, I feel like that showed me something, because A, he's a kid who's noticed race. He's noticed skin color. He's noticed hair types. He notices who looks like who. And that notice, when their family doesn't exactly look like another family member, is interesting. Especially you hear adults say, well, my kid doesn't see color. I'm like, I mean, was in the school system. I know they most definitely do. And the issue isn't whether kids notice this difference, because we know that they do. But the question is, what information are we giving them to understand those differences? So what do we do when our Black son was thinking he was a white boy? We became more intentional about talking and explaining through what is melanin. So we grabbed a couple of books. We grabbed Because of Melanin, was the first book. The second book, Our Skin, A First Conversation About Race. And M is for Melanin, A Celebration of the Black Child. Those books really helped us have really, I would say, natural conversations. We explained to him that our bodies make something called melanin, and melanin helps give our skin hair and eyes and their color. And people have different amounts of melanin, which is one reason human beings come in so many different skin tones, right? Very light, tan, golden, brown, dark brown, and just like everything in between. And for him, we felt like the real important lesson was Black does not have one skin tone. Your dad can have dark skin, you can have light skin, I can have light skin, and we still can be Black. And so your kids, siblings can have the same parents and not come out the exact same shade. So like my brother and I are a great example. My brother's really brown and I'm very light skinned. But we have the exact same face and we have like the same obnoxious laugh. And we have the same parents. And that means, for like me and my brother, you can favor one parent more. Your sibling can favor another parent, or somebody can look like a grandma, or somebody's like great great grandpa. And then that's a whole other conversation of like genetics, because genetics is going to genetic no matter what's happening. We don't get to explicitly decide what skin tone you're going to be, because I just don't want him learning like your skin is beautiful. I want him learning that skin tone does not determine whether you belong or how important you are. And his lighter complexion doesn't make him less connected to our family, or my husband's darker complexion doesn't make him, less connected to our family. And at 5, I feel like this is a very real and important and appropriate conversation about race, because it's just not a conversation centered on oppression. It really starts with like, who am I? Who is my family? Why do we look different? Why do people have different skin colors? Where do I belong? And again, that's building the foundation of his racial literacy. And we all already understand that this country is facing a literacy crisis. So why not do our kids a favor in this secular progressive homeschooling world and be intentional about building their racial literacy? And it starts with their identity. So race does not have to begin with racism. I think this is something we sometimes miss. I feel like parents feel like I need to talk to my kids about race, and they start thinking about, slavery, segregation, police brutality, racial violence. And yes, all those conversations will eventually matter, but race is bigger than racism, because children are supposed to and need to learn about their identity and their culture and their family and their skin, their hair, their language, their traditions, their community, joy and belonging, to like have a solid foundation of who they are. Because I don't want a kid's first understanding of Black people to be about slavery, and I don't want their first introduction to like Indigenous identity to be about removal, and like the Latino identity to be so tied to immigration, and Asian identity to be tied to like discrimination or stereotypes. Kids should be able to see people as whole human beings before we start asking them to understand all the ways society has harmed particular groups, especially here in the United States. And I think that's why it's important to really understand the importance of representation and not just books specifically about race. I know this is important, especially for people who are building their libraries and are being very intentional with their home libraries or the books that they check out, the books they purchase. I want all kids to read books about Black kids being in joyful experiences or solving mysteries, and Latino kids having adventures and not just the stories about them crossing the border, or Asian kids being goofy because we know they get stereotyped as like the super smart brainiac kids. I want to see them in a different role. I want kids to be exposed to an Asian identity that's away from the typical stereotype. And I want, Indigenous kids existing in the present. And I want kids with different skin tones and languages and abilities and family structures to just be living life in the text that you're exposing your kids to, because your bookshelf should not communicate that the white kids are the center of all the stories. Everybody else gets sideline stories or stereotypical stories. No, everybody deserves joy and everybody gets adventure and everybody should be magical and just exist to their ability and not always, exist in trauma stories. Differences are normal and that their own identity is worthy of being celebrated, to have pride, and that people within the same racial group can look very different. And it is absolutely wrong to mistreat someone because of who they are. And sometimes people are treated unfairly because of race, and there's a word for that, and it is called racism. And also, if you see someone being hurt, you can do something. You can go tell an adult. You can speak up. You can invite someone in to say, hey, they're pushing someone down the slide and they don't like it. And go tell a bigger kid or a sibling you know? Or if someone experienced an ouch, you can offer them a hug or like some level of comfort and say that wasn't okay. That I feel like that in itself is plenty of a foundation for a 5-year-old. And then from there, the conversation will grow because we still can't be teaching like a 14-year-old. People are different, so be nice. That's where we'll have to make the change. So, how do we make the change? I feel like around upper elementary, maybe like 8 through 11, I think children in general are ready for more vocabulary. And the vocabulary I've introduced to my kids at around that age is bias, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and racism specifically, because I feel like they can begin to understand that these words do not all mean exactly the same thing. And I feel like this is where I start introducing the idea, or where I have started the idea, that racism isn't only about one person being mean to another person. That's when we start really looking at the rules, right? What are the laws, the schools, the neighborhoods, the government, the institution? One kid refusing to play with another kid because they are Black is one kind of problem. And a law saying that Black kids cannot attend the same school as white kids, now we're talking about something bigger. It's layered there, right? And I feel like that's when we can lean on history to tell more of the story and to do more of the work, and where we can see slavery and resistance and colonization and indigenous removal and Jim Crow and civil rights. But I think we have to be thoughtful about how we teach this, because kids can be very sensitive and this could be very heavy. So if you teach oppression without resistance, you are teaching a very incomplete story, and that's a huge disservice to your kids' education. Because so what I want you to understand is, if you teach slavery, you also have to teach resistance. And if you're teaching segregation, you also have to teach organizing. Then, like, if you're looking at colonization, you need to teach indigenous nations before the Europeans arrive. Like, what was their day-to-day? What was their history? What were their inventions? How many tribes spanned across North America? And even talk about how and where indigenous people are living today. And it's the same approach with Black history. Do not make the entire story like something was done to Black people. You need to teach what Black people built, what arts they were involved in, their science, the literature, the community, businesses, and politics and music, and like the impact of mutual aid, especially like from the Black Panthers, different movements throughout history, and like Black people joy. I love to teach the Harlem Renaissance. I know that's not the only time period, but I love to teach the joy of Black people through the Harlem Renaissance. And I think upper elementary is also a great age to start using primary sources. So instead of only telling them what happened, you need to let them like physically examine things, like look at Google or look up like a photograph, or like find some old newspaper clippings or research old laws and look at old maps and ask, like, who created this? What did you notice? Who had power? Who benefited? Do you think anybody was harmed? If so, who was harmed? Whose perspective isn't included here? And like, even at a newspaper article, like, who do you think they were trying to reach with this message? And I think that's where the transition starts, from moving from teaching kids facts to teaching them how to think about history. So what is happening in middle school? Like, what are we talking about? How are we layering the race and racism conversation? So for middle school, I think we should be direct. I think this is where kids can understand, systemic racism. And that's where you can break down examples of it happening in housing and education, voting, employment, policing, immigration, healthcare, environmental racism. The list literally goes on. I feel like this is where you can change the questions. Like, how did this happen? Was there a law behind it? Do some research. Who created that policy? Who do you think benefited from it? Do you think anybody was challenging it? Like, what happened when the policy changed? What was the impact? Did changing the law immediately fix everything? Were there any effects that remained? Because this is also the age where media literacy becomes incredibly important because our kids are consuming information constantly, whether it's like on YouTube or social media, gaming, music, group chats. Oh, I hate group chats. News clippings and just like algorithms and memes. And so now we're focusing not only on racial literacy, but we're also focusing on, media literacy. And we also can still ask, like, who created this? Who and what are they trying to make people believe? Like, where do you think this statistic came from? Do you think there's like a bias lens with this statistic? Let's go look it up. Let's look it up to see if it was a credible source. And is there any context missing? And then like jokes. Oh, man. Looking at jokes and seeing if there was like an underlining racial stereotype happening here, right? And is this source verifiable somewhere else? Because I don't want my kids to repeat, I just don't want them to simply repeat the correct progressive talking points, because that's not enough for me. I want them to understand why and why they believe something. I want them to know how to investigate a claim, and I want them to be capable of changing their opinion when evidence requires it. I recently had a conversation with a childhood friend who made an obscene post about feminists needing to respect America, and like without America we wouldn't have all these rights, and we're not one of these more conservative countries. And so like I was going back and forth with her because in her actual like job field, she works in a very male dominated field. And I was like, yo, you've got to be kidding me. You're over here shaming feminists for expecting this country to be and do more. And you are literally benefiting from it. I mean, even with like data points and stuff, there wasn't the ability to evolve, which is usually how it is, but that doesn't mean our kids have to be that way. They need to be able to research the claim and make sure it's a viable source, and also change their opinion when evidence requires of it. Point blank, period. So high school, we can go real deep. We can give them some complexity. We can really dig into like redlining and housing discrimination, school segregation, voting restrictions, mass incarcerations, immigration policy, environmental racism, medical racism, colorism, racial wealth disparities, media representation, intersectionality, right? And I will say intersectionality, colorism has been things in redlining of things I've was introduced to my kid in middle school. But again, you can take it a different depth, because this is where we need to ask like really hard questions and not be afraid of it, because we've been doing our job building their, racial literacy at this point. So we can look and say, what is the author claiming here? What evidence supports it? Like, where are they trying to go with this? Are they trying to influence anybody? Is this actual information that's not being made up? And like, what happened before this to get here? Who do you think is going to benefit from this information? Like, what is the data actually showing? Where is the source sourced from? Are there primary sources we can examine? Because for me, this matters, because in my particular homeschooling journey with my kids, we have a very justice-centered education. And even with the justice-centered education, it should still be education. And my values absolutely shape our homeschool. Of course they do, right? And everybody's values influence what they teach and how you teach it. And that's what the state of Texas and these other states who are passing these Bible laws need to understand. Not everyone has the same values to teach your version of Christianity. And it's hard. I just don't think, right? I didn't know Texas public school teachers, had the ability to be they went to theology school and are prepared to have those in-depth conversations about religion with kids. I don't care how great the curriculum is. Because my kid's going to go, are you sure? What does that mean? That sounds abusive. So anyway, I don't know if teachers are ready for that, but I don't want to hand my teenager, who I only have a few years left with technically in this home education journey, I don't want them to just this is the opinion my family approves of, and I've just memorized it. I really want them to not just memorize things, but I want them to be able to say, well, this is history, these are the sources, and here's the evidence. Like, what do you think? And if my kid comes back and says, Mom, I don't agree with you, okay, show me what you found. Let's talk about it. And that's what I want. I want my kid to be able to go and articulate why they don't agree with me and find sources and facts. Because then I feel like that's going to help them with their media literacy and not internalizing all this BS and propaganda. So is there a curriculum for teaching racism? What curriculum teaches racism, y'all? Because there are absolutely books and lessons and educational resources specifically designed to teach race and racism and bias and, social justice. But I don't think there's one curriculum that does carry the entire job from kindergarten through graduation. And overall, when I'm thinking about racial literacy, I think it's too broad for that. I think it does belong in the same conversation as history and literature and civics and current events, and family conversations and community experiences. And sometimes it will be an explicit lesson about racism. Other times you're just studying housing and discovering what redlining is. And, in government, you're offering a government curriculum. You can talk about voting laws and gerrymandering. And if you're looking at science, I think it's important to look at how race has affected medical research and access to care, and take a deep dive in the Tuskegee experiments. If you're watching something on TV or online, talk about stereotypes. I think it's a thread throughout education rather than, all right, kids, today we're going to go over the racism unit, or we're only going to talk about Black history during Black History Month. It has to be, again, small conversations woven through experiences in your homeschooling journey, and hopefully you can get like a gist of like how the questions change for me in my household, with a kid who's in lower elementary, a kid who's in upper elementary, a kid who's in high school, and how I use the questions I shared with you on this episode on how to address it with your kids. So, what are some resources? I think on the show, I want to, and I try to, as often as possible, offer you guys resources that I've used or I have experience with that I believe in. I mentioned the books earlier, Because of Melanin, Our Skin, A First Conversation About Race, and M is for Melanin, a celebration of the Black child. And I want you to be able to pair books about race with stories where diverse kids, are shown to be kids and not victims of trauma. A really good book for upper elementary that we did with our kids is Stamped for Kids. And we use a lot of museum resources and primary resources specifically to go alongside our history studies. Some resources you can lean on for middle school and high school are Learning for Justice is always like, that should be bookmarked on your computer and tabbed. The Zinn Education Project has amazing lessons. Teaching for Black Lives. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture has some great resources online. And a new one that we've come across is Embrace Race. It has some resources that are specifically for adults who are trying to navigate these like difficult conversations with kids. And here's something else. You do not have to agree with every sentence in every resource, because I don't. You are the educator in your homeschooling journey. Read it, feel it, evaluate it, compare it to some things, ask questions to the text, see if you can find answers to it in the text. I want you to be able to use what helps your kid understand the subject more deeply. You know where they're at or where you want them to go. Find those resources and use them, because we don't need to replace one rigid curriculum with another. And we just need to ask questions in the material that we're using. And again, the biggest thing I want you to walk away with: don't turn trauma into your curriculum or your activity. And I've seen this, especially from white parents, a lot. And it's so harmful. I don't want you to turn racial trauma into like a simulation because, somebody thinks their kid needs to experience that hands-on experience of history. Yeah, don't hold a pretend slave auction. Don't have your kids pretend that they are enslaved. There is a meme or like a reel. Don't have your kids crawling under desks, quote unquote, simulating the Underground Railroad. Don't do these play scenarios. And this is stuff like I've seen on social media or in conversations of things. Don't do role play. Don't have one kid discriminate another kid to prove a point or to say, this is what racism feels like. Does it feel good? No, that's BS. We do have primary resources available and just different testimonies. You can look up oral histories and photographs and print them out. You can use and look up historical records, look at literature, use your libraries and museums. Because we absolutely can teach terrible things truthfully without having to turn another person's trauma into a learning opportunity. Because kids, they don't need to be traumatized to understand that something was hurtful or harmful or traumatic. And also, different kids will just need different things. And this is probably one of the most important points of the conversation. Not every kid's racial education is going to look exactly the same. Some kids are going to try to understand their own racial identity. Some kids have already experienced racism. Some kids may be a part of a multiracial family. And that's complex in itself. Some kids live in communities where everybody looks the same, and some of them live in communities where they don't look like anybody around them. There are some kids who are just motivated to ask hundreds of questions and others who aren't. And I feel like that changes your starting point. But I still think there's a common goal. We want kids to know who they are. We want them to understand that people are different without seeing differences as something threatening. And we want them to recognize stereotypes and biases. And we want them to understand racism when they are developmentally ready for the deeper explanations, and we want them to have access to an accurate history and, recognize unfair systems. And eventually we want them to have enough knowledge and critical thinking ability to be able to examine the world for themselves. And I think that's useful whether you're raising Black kids, brown kids, white kids, multiracial kids, or some combination of all of that in one family. And so back to the question that started this whole episode. How do you talk to a 5-year-old about race? Start with what's in front of you. If they notice skin color, talk about skin color and don't make it something that's shameful. Because I know and another thing, I know when people say, oh, my kids don't see skin color. Like, I get what you're trying to say. You're trying to say you have a kind kid, a kid that plays with everyone. But that's doing a huge disservice, and it's socially irresponsible to say that. If they ask about melanin, explain it to them. If they're figuring out who they are, help them understand their identity. And if they notice somebody that looks different, and it becomes a thing, don't shush them like difference is something embarrassing or something shameful, redirect the conversation and say, yeah, of course they do look different, and that happens sometimes, but they're still a human being, and if they're in a wheelchair, like, address the wheelchair, and how the wheelchair helps increase accessibility and why it's important for this person to have a wheelchair, and name it being paraplegic who's having to use the wheelchair. If they see or experience an ouch moment, talk about it. And again, read books with diverse characters and make sure that those characters experience joy too. And if racism explicitly comes up, name it and say, sometimes people are treated unfairly because of their race, and that is called racism. And that's enough to begin, because we're not trying to cram 18 years of racial literacy into the brain of a 5-year-old. We're building. And at 5, that wasn't fair. When they, get a little older, you say, well, why do you think that happened? Then you can piggyback on that. Why did that keep happening? Then layer on that. Was there a law or a system behind it? Is there history that connects to what we see today? And then eventually, like when they're in high school, you have the more complex question of, what does the evidence show, and what do you think about it? My 5-year-old is currently somewhere around, wait, my dad can be darker than me, and we're both Black. And honestly, that's exactly where he needs to be. And that's where we're building from. We're building on celebrating his identity and the celebration of how melanin has just a wide range and variety that is still connected to Blackness. So whatever is your kid's starting point, you can build there too. So thank you. Thank you for listening to the Secular Homeschool Revolution. Remember, we are not recreating school at home. We are not offering a traumatizing education to our kids. We are reimagining what education can be. And I will have my resources listed in my show notes. Until next time, keep asking hard questions, keep having conversations, and keep the revolution alive. If you appreciate my work, please like, comment, subscribe, donate to buy my coffee. I look forward to next week.